Welcome to this week's episode of Seeking Proof, Finding Grace. I'm your host, Ron Campbell, and this week, as with every week, I want to start off by reminding you of the most important truth in the entire universe. God loves you. Now, we have been walking through the time frame between 33 AD and 70 AD, Jesus' death and resurrection, all the way up to the destruction of Jerusalem. And we've been looking at when many historians believe, I'm going to say many, historians believe that these letters are written. And some of these, I'm going to be honest, I tend to be more aggressive in terms of believing that the Gospels were written early. The dates that I'm giving you quotes around for Paul's letters and things like that, not that, I don't think anymore they're considered to be that shocking. I think they're considered to be pretty consistently agreed upon by many scholars today. And so when we look at this, I'm going to fully admit, I'm a bit more aggressive when it comes to the timing and the dating of some of the Gospels. But in terms of Paul's letters, I think there's pretty good agreement by a lot of scholars on that today. So again, we left this mid-50s, and we had said that Paul's letters to 1st and 2nd Corinthians were written around 55 AD. James, the Lord's brother, his book is written somewhere around it's prior to 62 AD. And probably, let's say somewhere in the 50s. I believe that Mark and Matthew are both clearly written in the 50s. And I'm going to pin that down tonight as the reason I believe that. If most theologians are correct, and that Mark is the first gospel, and then Matthew is the second gospel, and very clearly in Luke's gospel, he is using Mark as a source. The question becomes, when did Luke write his gospel? And the date that's going to drive a lot of this for us is right around 62 AD. Now, we haven't gotten there quite yet, but there's going to be a group of things that start happening in 62 AD that are going to drive us to that conclusion. And so I want to start with that, and then I'm going to kind of work my way backwards a little bit into this. So I mentioned last time, right around 57 AD, Paul is going to be captured. I'm going to start with that. Actually, let me change my order a little bit. I'm going to start with that, and then I'm going to move forward, and then we're going to kind of work our way around this a little bit, and you'll understand why. 57 AD, approximately, Paul goes back to Jerusalem, and he meets with the early church, and he gives them a report of the amazing things that have happened on this third missionary journey. I mean, it's amazing the things that God has been able to do through Paul. And the church looks at him and goes, there's a lot of people in town who are really unhappy with you right now because Jewish people have come from all over the Roman Empire to Jerusalem to worship. And they say, it might be good because you've ruffled a lot of feathers. Because what would happen is Paul would go into these towns and he would first go to the synagogue and he would preach the gospel to the Jewish people at the synagogue. And some of them would believe and some of them didn't. And a lot of times, Luke details for us in Acts that those people who didn't believe, the second they saw Paul then going out and going, okay, if you guys don't believe, I'm going to go preach the gospel to the Gentiles. And that was offensive to that Jewish audience. And again, to the people who are not believers, but to that Jewish audience, they looked down on the Gentiles like you cannot imagine. They were unclean people. They were pagans, many of them. And the pagan part is true. In ancient Rome, they worshipped every god under the sun imaginable. So the Jewish people would have been very offended by that. And there was a lot of problems stirred up. Paul was, in one situation, the way Luke describes it, Paul may have actually been stoned to death. And then through prayer, he might have been raised back up again from the dead. It's difficult to say because it sounds like he was stoned to the point where they thought he was dead. And it's a question of, well, did they think he was dead or was he actually dead? But Paul is beaten. He is thrown in prison. He's threatened with death. He may have been killed at one point. He was at least beaten to the point of nearly death, no matter what. So Paul has suffered mightily. But there's a lot of people who are not loving Paul right now, and they're really, really, really unhappy with him. And the early church who's there in Jerusalem goes, it might be good for you to go show everybody that you are still a proper Jewish person, that you follow the law, you're going to do these things. They said, why don't you go in and go cleanse yourself before you go to the temple? Why don't you go through all of those acts that you would do? Because again, Paul is not one of the Gentile believers. Paul's a Jewish believer. And Paul you can tell in Paul's letters how important his Jewish heritage is to him. And good for him, it's amazing. So they look at him and go, Paul, why don't you go do this? And Paul's like, you know what? That's a good idea. I'll go do that. So Paul shows up at the temple, and he's in the midst of doing this, trying to show everybody, hey, look, I'm still a good Jewish believer. Yes, I follow Yeshua. I follow Jesus as the Messiah, but I'm still a Jew. And it goes sideways. It goes sideways really, really badly. And so Paul is arrested, and he's thrown in prison there in Rome for inciting a riot, basically. And they're basically to the point of almost killing him. When the Roman soldiers come down, they find Paul about to be beaten to death, drag him out of there to protect him. And this is where Paul starts showing how shrewd he is. So Paul gets arrested by the Romans, and the Roman commander goes, take that guy in there and have him beaten to find out exactly what he did. And Paul plays the first of his cards at this point, and he goes, oh, no, wait. I'm a Roman citizen. You can't do that. And at that point, all the guards go, oh, hold on. We're not allowed to beat Roman citizens. And so they all take a step back, and the Roman centurion is like, so you're Roman, are you? And he goes, I'm a free man as well. It cost me a great deal of money to buy my freedom. And Paul tells him, I was born free, which means Paul probably came from a very well-to-do family. And so at this point, the Roman centurion is like, okay, guys, second thought, we're going to just make sure this guy stays safe, and we're going to just keep him safe from the crowd out here who wants to kill him. But as Paul is going in, they're getting ready to take him. Paul goes, hang on a minute. Let me try talking to these people. And actually, he does this before he talks to the Roman leader. But he tries to address the audience, and he does so in Hebrew. And so the audience quietly listens to him and goes, well, no, wait a minute. This guy's speaking Hebrew, so maybe we heard wrong about him. And he does the speech, and he's walking them right up to that point through it, where he's saying, hey, I believed, and I met the risen Jesus on the road to Damascus, and wow, did that change my life? And everybody's like, really? Okay, it's interesting. Right up until the point where he says, and Jesus, I was sent out to go preach to the Gentiles, and that's it. Again, same issue. Now they want him. Now they were like, okay, hand him back to us, and we'll take care of this guy. So then he has a conversation with the Roman centurion. They put him in prison, try to keep him safe for a little while, and then they find out there's a plot to kill him. And so they rush Paul off to the governor. And again, we know some timing in all of this. We think this probably happened around 57 AD because Felix, who is the governor who's going to be watching over Paul, I may be getting his title wrong. I think he was governor. He might have been something else. But they send Paul off to Felix. Well, Felix, again, kind of a shrewd guy, he's willing to entertain both sides of this. He's protecting Paul because he recognizes, well, Paul's a Roman and we got to keep him safe. And he knows a great deal about the Jewish background here. And when the Jews come up from Jerusalem to demand that Paul be given to them because they want to put him to death, he's kind of going back and forth. And he doesn't really give an answer. He won't release Paul. He recognizes he doesn't want to send him back to Jerusalem because he's going to die. So he imprisons Paul for a couple of years, which is kind of a weird thing to do. But apparently in the ancient world, this is what you did. Paul is not in a jail cell like we would think of. He has some ability to come and go, but he's there under the protection and house arrest of Felix. I'm going to propose this, that it's during this 2-year house arrest, I think this is when Luke writes down the Gospel of Luke. Luke is going to have a couple years on his hands here. And the thing that would make the most sense to me is Luke is probably going, okay, what are we going to do? No Netflix, no YouTube, no anything. What's he going to do to pass his time? I think this is when he starts interviewing eyewitnesses. I think this is when he probably pulls together his gospel. If that theory is right, that Luke is written somewhere between 57 and 59 AD, that means Mark and Matthew had to be written prior to that. And that makes a lot of sense. And the interesting thing is what we know about Luke's gospel. I love the way Luke starts his gospel. Luke chapter 1, verse 1. Inasmuch as many have taken in hand to set in order a narrative of those things which have been fulfilled among us. So he says, well, other people have written about this before me. Okay, Mark and Matthew, we know that. just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word delivered them to us. It seemed good to me also, having had a perfect understanding of all things from the very first, to write to you an orderly account, O most excellent Theophilus, that you may know the certainty of those things in which you were instructed. The interesting thing is, we know his benefactor here, the one who has commissioned him to write this, is someone named Theophilus. And the title that he gives to Theophilus there really raises some intriguing questions of who Theophilus was. I've heard a very interesting theory that Theophilus could have actually been a subsequent head of the Sanhedrin, that he might have actually been high priest or something like that. There was somebody named Theophilus who actually was. And the question is this guy that Theophilus? And the title that he gives him, Most Excellent Theophilus, actually lends some credence to that theory. It's a theory, again, not my theory, but it's an interesting idea. So Paul is imprisoned for 2 years there, and finally, because Paul is caught in the middle of this back and forth, the Jews who want to take him to Jerusalem to kill him, Paul being a free man and really knowing that he's done nothing wrong, eventually Felix is recalled around 59 AD, and we know at some point around here, Paul is going to finally go, you know what? I'm a Roman citizen. I appeal to Caesar. And it's at that point that a new ruler who's come in looks at Paul and goes, you know, realistically speaking, this guy probably hasn't done anything actually wrong, worthy of death. But he has appealed to Caesar, and to Caesar he shall go. And they send him off to Caesar. Now, again, the timing on this, most believe Paul probably goes to Rome around 60 AD. So again, we are less than 30 years after Jesus died, and all of these things have happened. I am going to assume, and again, this is a bit aggressive timing on my part, Matthew, Mark, and Luke have all been written by this point. Paul reaches Rome, and between 60 and 62 AD, many historians and theologians believe that Paul's captivity letters are written. That's going to be Philippians, Philemon, Colossians, and Ephesians. Ephesians is my favorite book of the New Testament. I absolutely adore it. It's incredible. I can't recommend it to anybody more. But anyway, throw that out there for what it's worth. So at some point in all of this, Luke is going to write the book of Acts. And we know it has to be right around here. And this is the reason I'm going to say that. We know is probably a bit strong of an assertion. The most likely explanation is Acts is completed before 62 AD. And the reason I say that is there is a major event that happens in the church in 62 AD. James the Just, the brother of Jesus, is killed in Jerusalem. This is from the Lexham Bible Dictionary, quoting from Josephus, the Jewish historian. Josephus provides a brief account of the circumstances and details of James' death. According to Josephus, the high priest Ananus the Younger took action against James after Festus' death, Festus being one of the Roman leaders in the area. And before the new Albinus had arrived as the new Judean procurator. Ananus convened the judges of the Sanhedrin and brought before them a man named James. This is quoting from Josephus, the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ, and certain others. He accused them of having transgressed the law and delivered them up to be stoned. Now, the reason that quote is so important is a couple different reasons. Number one, Josephus quotes that James has been murdered. Nobody doubts that. That's a historical event. It coincides with what the early church fathers taught as well. But James references Jesus. This is the second quotation from Josephus. Josephus references Jesus so that the reader understands who James was. James would not have been that well known to Josephus's readers. So Josephus does the same thing that any of us would do. He says, hey, so this guy named James is killed by the leaders of the Sanhedrin. You know, he's the brother of Jesus. And he references Jesus being the more famous person. So there's two different references that Josephus makes, and this one is not questioned by any historians. So here you have an external reference from a Jewish source, a very unsympathetic source to the early church, referencing the fact that James the Just has died. Now, what's interesting in that, again, is that happens in 62 AD is the commonly held date. Luke never records that for us in the book of Acts. And if Luke records the death of John's brother James, you can absolutely be sure that Luke would have recorded the death of James, the Lord's brother and the leader of the church in Jerusalem. He absolutely would have recorded it. So why didn't he? Well, there's only one logical explanation in all of this. He doesn't, it happens before he finishes the book of Acts. There's two main reasons that actually three main reasons that we think that. Number one, James' death is not recorded in Acts. Number two, Peter's death, which will rapidly be coming up on here in a minute, is also not recorded in Acts. And number three, Paul's death is not recorded in Acts. When Acts is completed, at the end of the book of Acts, all three of them are alive. Paul, James, and Peter, all of them still alive. Paul is in prison in Rome, and the narrative ends. Well, if Luke has been such an amazing historian this whole time, he's picked up all these details. Why in the world would he leave out three of the biggest things that ever happened in the first century to the early church? Why wouldn't he record them? Unless they hadn't happened. And the other thing he doesn't record, obviously, is the destruction of Jerusalem. He never picks it up. And again, if this is written late, if all of the Gospels are written late, then why wouldn't, again, so Jesus makes the prophecy that Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. Why wouldn't they say, and just as Jesus prophesied 30 years later, whatever it was, I guess it'd be 37 years later, just as the Lord had prophesied, Jerusalem was destroyed. Ha! See that? They would have gloated. They would have said something about it. They would have pointed to that. Unless Jerusalem is still standing. And that's what we're going to see in all of this. The other interesting point in all of this is Luke is actually quoted by Paul in 1 Timothy. And Luke is going to write 1 Timothy. Those are his pastoral letters. Again, historians generally place those in the dates between 62 and 64 AD. Paul is going to write 1 Timothy. And he actually quotes from Luke's gospel. So Luke had to have written his gospel by then because Paul quotes from it. Paul is clearly aware of it, and he actually quotes from it in his letter in 1 Timothy. So all of this had to have come together here in the late 50s and very early 60s. And all of it is going to be precipitated by Paul's capture, his arrest, and his imprisonment. But this brings all of these pieces together. And what it allows us to do is take a couple of events that we have a very good feel for when they happened and use those events, just placing them in context of the narrative that we have from Paul's letters and from what's going on in the book of Acts and what's going on in the Gospels, let's be honest. It allows us to piece all of those together and go, well, now wait a minute. If Luke is the third gospel written because he's quoting from Mark and Matthew's quoting from Mark, and if Paul is actually quoting from Luke's gospel as he's writing his letters, and we know that Acts is written after Luke, it starts to drop all these pieces together. And what it gives us is this. The gospels themselves, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the best timing for them, I believe, is in the 50s. It makes the most sense. That, I think, is the best answer on the table. Now, again, it's an aggressive dating. I will be the first to admit that. But it answers those questions better than any of the other possibilities. If Acts is really written late, then why doesn't Luke record the death of three of the most important people in the early church? If Luke quotes from Mark and quotes from Matthew, Mark and Matthew have got to be in circulation. He's got to have had a copy. He's got to have read the copy. And then he's got to incorporate that into his writing. He does not have a MacBook and just out there typing away by candlelight in the evenings. It's a slow, laborious process to interview these people and write these things down. When you look at them and you start to bring all of these historical events together, the best dating of the first three Gospels is in the 50s, in my opinion, my humble opinion. And then what we see is the most likely dating for Acts is before 62 AD, before James dies, before Peter dies, and before Paul dies. And that, I think, is probably a good stopping point tonight. We're going to wrap this up next time. We are super close. We've got a little bit further to go. We're going to wrap this up next time and bring all of this together. I want to thank you so much for joining me, and I really hope you've enjoyed this journey through the scriptures. If you have, I hope you'll consider hitting the like button for this episode and the subscribe button for the podcast. You can follow us on iTunes or Spotify. You can also find our podcasts here on YouTube. You can find helpful information on our website at prooftoggrace.com. And if you've got questions, don't hesitate to email at prooftoggrace@yahoo.com. I'll do the best I can to try to answer. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you have a blessed and amazing week. And I hope this is starting to bring together for you an understanding of this idea. The Gospels were not written late. And the time between when Jesus died and when these things were committed to writing is very, very short, which brings together the very high likelihood that the people who wrote them were the eyewitnesses who were there. And they talked to the eyewitnesses who were there. They interviewed those eyewitnesses. And as we wrap this up next time, then what we're going to do is pull all of this together and figure out not only how was this stuff passed on orally, but how long was it? How long did it really have to be done? Because if Jesus dies in 33 AD and the Gospels were being committed to writing in the 50s, that's not long at all. And the eyewitnesses would have definitely been there, many of them, that's for sure. Thank you once again for joining me, and I hope to see you next time.